the title that I chose to use for this exhibit is The Ties That Bind. And it's an idea that I find really intriguing because it can be so positive and negative, and that idea. And so, the threads that hold us in our lives are what add stability, but sometimes that is also difficult. And for me, these pieces were challenging those ideas and kind of sorting through them. And so most of these pieces were done, they were stitched while I was traveling through the world and, finding my way through the world. And so a lot of them incorporate textiles from my life. And so from the time I was a small child, I collected odd bits of cloth. That's kind of my memory keepers. It's kind of a note-taking method, journaling for Kate. And so a lot of those I included in these pieces. So the large piece at the back of the gallery, that includes pieces of curtains that hung in the very first home that I lived in with my husband in a cabin in Vermont without running water. So they're special to me. And so stitching them together and, that identity that we create in the world has everything to do with this approach for me. Most of my work is through teaching. And so I think of the action of sharing this type of information, the creation of cloth. And also one of my personal missions is to help crafters feel like artists and to take their work seriously. And so we all have those fleeting ideas, and we look at a beautiful pile of wool and it makes us think of a sunset or something like that. And artists often hold on to those ideas, and craftspeople tend to let it float by as an artifact of living. And so I teach creativity classes and try to encourage people to use those ideas to help guide their work. And so that's the notebooks that are around the gallery are how I do that personally, and I travel around the country and share that with people. And so the act of sharing for me is part of the art of living, the creative part that keeps us going. A lot of the embroidery, the stitches themselves that you see in the pieces here in the exhibit are inspired by Japanese boro. And boro is a Japanese tradition that was carried on by peasants and farmers and people who would take lots of scraps of important textiles and stitch them, they would pile them together and stitch them into new whole cloth as an act of thrift and sustainability and enduring strength. So you can add these, it's called a running stitch, where you're just going in and out in lines or in shapes. And often in Japan, you'll find pieces of cloth that you cannot tell it's even a pile of individual pieces of cloth. It's been stitched and lined up so carefully. And I've brought a piece of cloth from an antique textile from Japan for you to see in the gallery. So you can see where I was getting some of this inspiration. And so it's a way of pulling odd pieces together. This knitted piece that's above us is really special to me, not just because of the fleece that I mentioned. It's a fleece that I have had for quite some time that was gifted to me by a special friend. And I spun it and thought of her as I spun the yarn. And the knitting motif was one that was special to me because I couldn't find the pattern that I wanted. I had been dreaming of this pattern, and finally I decided I was just going to have to design it. And this is knitted lace rather than lace knitting. And so that means that there are pattern stitches on both the right side and the wrong side of the pattern. And that can make it pretty difficult to knit sometimes. And so I love that. I feel like it's a fairly simple pattern, but in order to get it just right, you had to kind of stand on your head to do it. And it's all, the frame is made with branches from the forest that my husband and I tend. So it's very special to me.